As everybody knows, Russian President Vladimir Putin is evil. He's wicked. He's irrational, and he wants to conquer all of Western Europe. Not really. I'm just kidding. That's the caricature we've made in the West, though. That's almost an article of faith by many in the United States and by extension into Western Europe. But as we're discovering a little bit more frequently, not everybody is lining up behind this fiction. And we're going to talk about a speech that Hungarian President Viktor Orban gave over the weekend on Saturday, actually in Romania, to some Hungarian speakers about how he's getting more and more bold about being honest about what he sees is going on. One of those, the king has no clothes kind of speeches. He's saying out loud what a lot of other people are thinking, but few are willing to say out loud. But one who is willing to call things as they are is former State Department official Matthew Ho, who was back with us again today. One of my mom's favorite guests on the show. So it's always good. Hi, Mom. Always good to have Matt back. I know when you're on, Matt, that my mom's going to be watching it. So that's always a good thing, a double benefit for me. So welcome back.
I appreciate it, Danny. Thanks for having me back on. And Mrs. Davis, thank you for your support.
Well, listen, let's get into this a little bit. So Orban, Matt, I think as we've talked on some of the previous shows you've been on, he's not shy or hasn't been shy of late, especially in the last few months, about, right before the NATO summit, a NATO leader in Hungary went to Kiev first to talk to Zelensky, then right to Moscow to talk to Putin, and then to Beijing to talk to Xi Jinping, among other people, saying, we don't need to be talking about more war. We need to be talking about ending this one, which was pretty bold at the time. He took a lot of heat for that. I think the European Union actually censured him for that. He was supposed to have some big meeting of foreign ministers a week or so ago, and to show their displeasure, the European foreign minister actually scheduled another meeting scheduled on the same day to make sure that nobody went to his. And it just sounds very petulant to me, but Orban is continuing on to go. And we're going to show how he went even a step further over the weekend. But first of all, I'm just kind of curious as to your thoughts on Viktor Orban and why he's coming out of late and being so bold in these comments.
Sorry, I've got a tree getting taken down across the street from me, so I've got to remain on mute while they're chainsawing. I think that's a good question about Viktor Orban to be asked to other heads of states. Why is Viktor Orban seemingly the only one doing this? What are you doing? Why do you feel like this is not in your role, your responsibility, or obligations as heads of states to be intervening here? And so say what you will about Orban in other ways. In this way, I think he is acting on the principle that he has an obligation as a head of state to do this. I think he also sees an opportunity for himself. Like anything else, there's multiple reasons, right? I think he can see an opportunity for himself that this is a way to make himself stand out amongst other European leaders. Also shows himself as a bold and forceful leader, willing to take on the West, willing to take on his own NATO allies about this. But then, I think there's the other aspect too, is that Orban is standing right there. He's looking into this war. Hungary is, if this war expands, Hungary is one of the nations that it may expand to. So whether it's the consequences of the war as they are, in terms of the refugees, the instability, the suffering that's occurring right next to him, or the possibilities of what may come, either in terms of escalation, where the war escalates into Hungary, escalation in the sense that it just gets larger and there's many more millions of refugees coming in. And then, of course, this idea that the Ukrainian state collapses and fails, and then essentially you have Syria or Afghanistan to Hungary's east. And, I think that's, that concern, that threat is probably also animating Orban as well.
Yeah. And, he specifically said a couple of things similar to that in the recent past, where one of the things he said is, look, I'm on the border here. This is not some distant thing for us. We have Hungarians in there. We have Hungarian citizens that are actually caught up in this war on the Ukraine side of it that have actually been killed in the war. So he said he cares about it a lot. But the second thing, I think, I tend to agree with you that I think he's trying to set himself apart because, and he has said this many times, going back more than a year, he said that, like you and I have observed, the war is militarily unwinnable for Ukraine. It doesn't matter what the West, NATO, anybody else does. It's pointless to go down a path that cannot succeed. So he's going down a path that I think he thinks is going to manifest, whether anybody in the West wants it to or not, so that if it goes that direction, I think he's tying himself to a future event to where he'll come out looking pretty good.
Correct. He's also made himself a figure as someone who is in the opposition. He has already, this isn't a new act he is trying out. He has risen to power as being one, a nationalist, one playing to popular sentiment, also playing to, of course, right-wing sentiment, something that may have been ignored for many years in Europe. So he's got that in his character already. He's got that in his image and his act already. So this just further alongs, I think, probably his own personal political desires or strengthens his own political base as well, standing in opposition. And I mean, and it's clear too who he's standing in opposition against. Standing up against those in the West, those in NATO, who are so willing to ignore the realities of this war, ignore the reality that, Danny, as you said, this war is militarily unwinnable. And so that's who he's standing up against, the people who are overseeing the wreckage of not just Ukraine, but also a great damaging of Europe, whether it be through refugees, whether it be through economic consequences, shortages of different things, So again, there's another reason we could see why he has chosen to go down this path.
And one of the he's kind of added a new category this past weekend when he spoke in Romania. That he pointed out he believes that there is a shifting of the balance of power that is already underway. It may take decades to fully manifest, but he says that the West is, in a sense, digging its own grave and helping to facilitate this. And I think based on what he said, his logic is pretty solid. And we'll talk about some of that. But first of all, let's look at the first clip here. And by the way, these clips here he's speaking in Hungarian. There are subtitles. Sometimes they're hard to read, so I'll kind of fill in some gaps for those who may not be able to. But here's the first clip.
Amiről beszélek, és amivel szemben állunk, az valójában egy világrendszerváltás. Ez pedig Ázsia irányából kiinduló folyamat. Röviden és primitíven fogalmazva, a következő hosszú-hosszú évtizedekben, de lehet, hogy évszázadokban, mert az előző világrendszer is 500 évig állt fönn, Ázsia lesz a világ meghatározó központja. Kína, India, Pakisztán, Indonézia, és sorolhatnám.
So, first of all, I'm just curious as to your thought on that. Is the balance of power might not be the right phrase, but the center of things seems to be shifting from the West, where it has been really, like you said, for the last 500 years, and he thinks it may take decades, but he sees an unmistakable shift to the East. Do you see it that way?
I do as well. Yeah, I do as well. I think along a number of lines, number of factors, whether it's economic, military, what have you, that political significance of the East, as we'll call it, has just grown almost exponentially compared to the West over these last decades. So I think he's absolutely correct in saying that that's where the things that matter globally are going to increasingly be controlled by or dominated by or at least influenced by.
Yeah, and the thing that is, I think one of the biggest problems that we have in the West, and we've been talking about this for well over a decade in the mainstream media and publications, where they talk about the potential shifting of the center of gravity of global affairs into the East as China's rising, others in the Asia Pacific area are rising, and it's always resisted like with fear in the West that like this is something that needs to be stopped or checked. And the thing that's ironic to me is that it doesn't need to be checked or stopped, nor is that to our disadvantage if it does. We can absolutely continue to benefit. We can keep ourselves safe. We can take advantage of that opportunity. It's business opportunities for trade and other kinds of things. And there is no evidence, and people claim this to the contrary, I think, that China's rise or any shift of center of the balance elsewhere is somehow going to mean that they're going to come after us with war. And that's always the implication. We have to stop this, otherwise we're going to fight a war. And I think that there doesn't need to be any war, and that everybody can actually benefit from the natural ebb and flow as it has throughout human history from one place to another. It doesn't automatically mean anybody else is going to go to war. It just means that the center is shifting.
Well, I think the fear is there in the West because that's what the West has done, not just in these last 30 years since the end of the Cold War, where to say that to underput it, the U.S. and the West were anything less than generous following the dissolution of the Soviet Empire or the Soviet Union. But this fear of this is what the East is going to do. This is what China and India, they're going to, Russia, they're going to be out of control and they're going to wage war around the world if they don't get what they want. If anything threatens their world order, they'll seek it out and destroy it, is because they're reflecting what we have done in the West, what empire after empire in the West, British, American has done, and then what we do now. And so I think it's just simply an aspect of their fears are projected from who they are themselves.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's hard to argue with a lot of that. And so many things we've done, especially since the end of the Cold War, because at that point, the center of balance of power and the center of everything in the world really was in the West, and primarily Washington, D.C. And we could and did do literally anything we wanted to. We didn't care what our allies in Europe said. We didn't care about what Russia, China, anybody else said. We expanded NATO. We went to war in Iraq in 2003 against the vehement opposition of our allies in Europe, et cetera. And nothing ever happened. So a lot of in the West think that's how it's supposed to be. But here's the next thing that Orban was talked about in his speech here. He says ordinarily, and especially since then, America is used to just giving instructions and people follow. But now all of a sudden, everybody's not following. Watch this.
A nyugat most is kiadta az elvárását, az utasítását, hogy a világ foglaljon állást Oroszország ellen és a nyugat mellett morális alapon. Ezzel szemben a valóság az lett, hogy lassan mindenki Oroszországot támogatja. Az, hogy Kína és Észak-Korea ezt teszi, talán nem meglepetés. Hogy Irán is ezt teszi, ismerve Irán történelmét és Oroszországhoz való viszonyát, az azért már valamelyest meglepő. De hogy India, amit a nyugati világ a legnépesebb demokráciának titulál, és az oroszok mellett van, ez melbevágó. Az, hogy Törökország nem hajlandó elfogadni a nyugat morális alapú elvárását, pedig NATO tag, végképp meglepő, és az, hogy a muszlim világ nem ellenséget, hanem partnert lát Oroszországban, teljesen vár.
So one of the things he's saying there, for if anybody may not have been able to read some of that print, was he's saying the West kind of gave its instructions, and when he says that, I think he's kindly talking about the United States, that Russia's supposed to be the enemy, and so everybody is supposed to follow suit and treat them like the enemy. But he said something strange is starting to happen, that people aren't following that instruction. As a matter of fact, he goes, some of them make sense. He goes, obviously Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, those make sense because they have historically been on Russia's side. He said, but then you get to what the West calls the biggest democracy in India is gravitating towards Russia's side. You may remember that big bear hug with Modi not long ago with Vladimir Putin. And then he says even NATO allies. So obviously Hungary is a NATO country who's very much not listening to the script. And now also Turkey. And we're going to talk about Erdogan here shortly. But they're not following the script either. And they're also talking about wanting to bring this to an end. How do you see that shifting, not just within the world, but even within the West itself is seeming to be no longer following instructions from Washington?
Yeah, I think that has only increased the anxiety, the anger what's leading to desperation. I think we've spoken about this before, Danny. This idea that a dying mule kicks hardest, and so as the American empire dissolves, as the West's control of the world dissolves, fades away, you're going to have more and more desperate attempts to bring it back into order, right? So that as things occur, the West, particularly the United States, will act in a way that exasperates the situation, right? Because they'll overact, they'll act violently, they'll cause greater damage. And so, one of the things you see, you give an example of that is it was this past weekend, the Washington Post had a big story on sanctions in the world and how the United States is pretty much the purveyor of sanctions in the world. Unilateral coercive economic methods, I think, as the World Bank calls it. And the idea is that 1/3 of the world is under American sanction.
I think they called it economic warfare by the United States.
That's what it is. Yeah, because back in the old days, if you sail your ships up to someone's harbor or port and blockaded it, that was an act of war. So cutting off their access to the banks, which is essentially what the American sanctions do, because if people aren't aware, all of the world's financial transactions route through the United States in some way, manner, fashion that allows them to fall underneath American law, which then allows the sanctions to be applied. And so that's essentially what occurs when the country is sanctioned, is that their ability to access money, to move money, to receive money, to send money is cut off. So you have, I think in they found that either 60 or 70% of the world's low-income people were under sanction.
Yeah, there's Gary showing it right there on the screen.
Yeah. I mean, just absolutely remarkable. And then to the point being, of course, is what's the result? It's not the political result that they speak about when they announce the sanctions at a conference at a think tank in Washington, D.C., right? It's the opposite. It's not the tearing down a government. It's not the people rising up and overthrowing a dictator, et cetera, et cetera. It's the immiseration of a population that understands that this is the consequence of foreign action. And so that then strengthens their support for the government. And that's what we've seen continuously around the world in terms of sanctions, is this inability for them actually to do what they claim to do. They keep nations in power and strengthen support internally while immiserating a population.
Yeah, and I personally observed that several years ago when I went on a church mission trip to Cuba, which was hard to get, but we had a small group that went in to do some ministering to some folks there, and I just saw firsthand, we're talking since 1962, I think it was, where we first started these sanctions on Cuba, in order to get rid of Castro, et cetera. Well, that obviously never worked. And now instead of saying, all right, well, that's dumb, there's no utility in that, they don't pose any threat to us, let's just get rid of that and, start living lives. We just have this emotional just compulsion. No, we can never let the sanctions go on Cuba. And now then they're having a horrible situation down there. And even I could see at the time, the impact on just normal people who don't have anything to do with anything is just horrible. And we could make that so much better just by lifting sanctions. Now, that's not to say that Cuban government doesn't have its own culpability for what's going on there. They do, but they don't need us to add to it when there's no value to our country.
Right. And like I said, and it strengthens that internal opposition. It's sort of like what the United States War Department found after the Second World War, that our aerial bombardments, mass aerial bombardments of Germany and Japan did not affect public will. That the theory of all this was disproved by the evidence of what occurred in the war, that, a lot of destruction, a lot of killing, damages the ability of a nation to build and to communicate and to transport, et cetera. But it doesn't affect the will of the people. In fact, it has the inverse effect, the opposite effect. And so, that's something that, when we get back to this idea of how is the West reacting to the rest of the world moving away from it, let alone the balance of power, the control of power shifting, as we were discussing, and they can't understand the reason why. They can't understand the reason that this is because of our actions. The way the world is a making is a making of the consequences of what we put in motion. The world is the reality we made it. And there are so many in the West who just don't want to accept that, and then accept the responsibility for that, which is the world's moving away. People are scrambling to get out from underneath the American empire as fast as possible.
And I think that you can see that graphically playing out in India, because they had every reason in the world to follow our lead as a democracy against the alleged Russians who were, unprovoked, in their invasion and all the genocidal war and all the kind of the statements that we've used. And yet you see India going, yeah, I'm just not buying it. And they're going to continue on to do business with both sides. And we haven't noticed that. Then also in China, of course, and I'm not going to go too far off into here because we may do that in a separate episode, but many of our actions in the Indo-Pacific, which we will touch on shortly, are just giving India or China more and more reason to try and oppose us. But the next thing that Orban said, just to stick with his line of reasoning there, is he's exposing how our actions on the Russians are also backfiring. So notice here, he's going to be talking about how our actions on Russia are not only not working, but it's making other people around the world, apparently to include Hungarians, to say who is the rational and who is the irrational figure. Watch this.
A háború felfedte azt a tényt, hogy a világ jelenlegi legnagyobb problémája a nyugat gyengesége, illetve szétesése. A nyugati média persze nem ezt állítja, a nyugaton azt állítják, hogy a világ legnagyobb veszedelme és problémája az Oroszország és az általa képviselt veszély. Ez tévedés. Oroszország a népességéhez képest túl nagy, ráadásul hiperracionális vezetés alatt áll, egyáltalán egy vezetett ország. Abban, amit csinál, nincsen semmi rejtélyes, logikusan következik az érdekeiből, ezért érthető és kiszámítható. Ellenben a nyugat viselkedése, mint eddig is talán kitűnt a szavaimból, nem érthető, nem kiszámítható, a nyugat nem vezetett, viselkedése nem racionális, és nem tudja kezelni azt a helyzetet.
I just found that part just amazing. And for those who may not have been able to read, he's contrasting this what we were, quote, told by the West, which is that Russia is, this bad guy and needs to be opposed. He said, but then you look at what they're doing. He said Russia is acting in a completely rational point of view. There's nothing mysterious about what they do. They their actions are based on their self-interest and so are therefore very predictable. He said, on the other hand, contrasted, he said the West is completely unpredictable and irrational in its claims. And so no one really knows what it's trying to do. And he said that is the biggest, what this war, the biggest thing it's exposed is the rationality of the Russian side and the irrationality of the Western side. And again, I think he's being kind, but I think he means Washington, because that's kind of who's calling the shots here.
Yeah, I think he definitely means Washington, Danny, because the Europeans are reliable and they'll go along with what Washington says. This idea of Russia being this bad actor that is predictable only because they're so maniacal and they'll always choose evil, is undone. I mean, and not apologizing or supporting the government there, but as Orban says, you can understand how that government acts in a rational, self-interested manner. And you could apply this to other nations. So you can apply this to Saudi Arabia. You can apply this to Egypt, in the sense that there are plenty of U.S. allies that are authoritarian dictatorships, military regimes, monarchies, whatever, that also act in a manner that is predictable because it is rational when you look at it from a strictly limited table of interests of things that are of self-interest.
Yeah, and it's that you would like to think that the West and the United States, and actually each individual country of the West, is also based on its interest. And ironically, or perhaps not ironically, Hungary has made comments many times, Orban specifically, that their actions are based on their national interest. So they are part of an alliance, but their actions are first and foremost what is in the national interest of Hungary. And if that diverts from what Washington is saying, they're going to go their own path. And one would wonder if other states are going to start doing that. And there is some evidence, actually, which I'll show in just a minute, that Hungary is one of those. He mentioned that a second ago. But before I get there, I want to get the last point that Orban said in his speech that I thought was important, in that he says that, on the one hand, there's a trend towards peace, which he's trying to push. But then simultaneously, he said, people better start paying attention to that before it's, quote, too late.
Az ukránoknak már leesett a tantusz, most már csak az európaiaknak kellene észhez térniük, addig, amíg nem késő.
Now he didn't go on to give a lot of detail of what he meant by that, but if I'm going by what he said in the past and what we have observed, and I think even in this own episode here, is that before it's too late means that if we continue on with the fiction, a la what we just did in NATO summit last couple of weeks ago, we're going to just, stay for as long as it takes and keep giving them all this stuff for another 10 years, etc. We may find that Ukraine isn't even around in that period of time because they may physically lose the war. I think that's what he meant by that.
Yeah, I think this is exactly what it meant. Or the war has reached some type, as we were saying before. Either there's it's not full out loss, right? But it's in a state of collapse, Ukraine. And people are fleeing because the government has lost control, so forth. That type of scenario, or of course the nightmare scenario that this has gone to World War III, and that either through just conventional destruction, but most especially and most dangerously nuclear destruction, that's the fate that came from the consequences of this war.
And it's so anguishing for us to watch because we know the consequence and the penalty being paid by the Ukrainian nation and its individual men is just so egregious, and it's avoidable. And that's where Hungary is coming down on. But I want to shift gears just a little bit here to show this is one man's opinion, fair enough. But when you start looking at the evidence that supports this, you start to see that, hey, maybe he is onto something here, and we should start following his lead instead of trying to force everybody to follow a lead that doesn't make any sense. He mentioned earlier on that Turkey, another NATO ally, was moving in directions related to the Russia-Ukraine war that's not exactly in line with what Washington wants, but it's not limited to that. So you also have Erdogan being willing to push back in other areas that are very important to Washington, like this.
A fierce critic of operations in Gaza, Turkey President Tayyip Erdogan has issued open threat to enter Israel. Erdogan cited earlier instance of intervention in Karabakh and Libya to make a case that Turkey won't hesitate doing the same if the situation demanded. He said, and I quote, "We must be very strong so that Israel can't do these things to Palestine," unquote. Moreover, he compared Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to Adolf Hitler, and I quote him again here, "Just as the genocidal Hitler met his end, so will the genocidal Netanyahu," unquote.
Those are pretty strong words, and especially just days after Erdogan addressed the joint session of Congress in Washington, talked to Trump, had a meeting with Harris, with Biden, and then right after that, you have Erdogan saying, "You know what? We may actually go in and attack the country of Israel, like we did with these other people here." I mean, that's a pretty major statement right there. Now, I know a lot of people, and I want your view on this, just dismiss anything Erdogan says as, oh, he's just a bunch of rhetoric. He doesn't mean anything. But some of those examples he gave are things they've actually done. So how serious do you view this potential of Erdogan? That's just today, by the way. Matt, your mic is muted, I think.
Sorry about that. Just over the weekend, I was having a conversation with a friend about what is Erdogan going to do. We wrote back and forth a little bit on email about what is going to happen with regards to Turkey and Erdogan. We referenced the other Arab nations too, but that was really a point I think we both agreed upon. This idea that, at some point, will Erdogan push the full might of Turkey into this war? I mean, this is something I think that has been on minds of people in a variety of different ways, not just for, like, say, the last 9 months, but for the last several years, that the Turks are not happy with the rule that they have. They're not happy being a vassal of the American empire. Certainly are advantages, there certainly are benefits they receive, but has it gotten to the point now where the political realities are such that whatever benefits Turkey got by being a loyal part of the American empire, a dutiful member of NATO, etc., simply not worth it politically. And then what does that unleash, particularly if there's an ability for the Turks to find support from other large and powerful nations? But the idea that Erdogan may be put in a position in the next, shortly, where he has to decide whether he can allow this continued assault, not just on Gaza, not just on Palestine, not just in Lebanon, but on what he would see as the entire Muslim world, the entire Middle East. Will he allow it, or will he finally, you could see the imagery there, live up to the expectations that he will be the one who, the next Saladin, if you will.
Yeah, and that takes a little more relevance to that, and who knows if this was part of what's animating his comments today. But there is increasing information out that Israel may be preparing, possibly within days, to actually launch an invasion into southern Lebanon against Hezbollah. And this event that happened over the weekend at a soccer field where a bunch of kids were killed, it's unclear whether that was an errant air defense missile that the Israelis fired that landed there, or if it was actually intentionally fired by Hezbollah from Lebanon. It's unclear right now. Both sides are claiming something different. So I don't have the ability to know yet what did happen, but it almost doesn't matter if Israel uses that to actually launch, expand the war into a new front, which then could potentially draw in Iran. What might Erdogan do?
Yeah, that's that's a scenario we don't want to see, right? Or if that leads to the point where Israel is bringing Beirut upon the same fate that they dealt to Gaza, which they've threatened a number of times.
Yeah,
you get to that point. I think one of the things we have to look at too is that even in this immediate moment, maybe nothing happens. But what you have is a Turkey, you have other nations there in the Middle East, as well as in those around the world. And we see, as we were talking about before, in the sense that people are leaving the American empire, they're forming and they're moving into their own organizations, their own alliances, their own orders, BRICS, SCO, etc. But then on a smaller, more regional level, you see these nations in the Middle East who are unable to answer Israel's genocide with anything other than words. And it's a great affront. It's an insult. It's a humiliation. And for possibly leaders that have grander aspirations than are within their national boundaries, like say someone like Erdogan, here is an opportunity to do something, but I can't. Right? Here's a chance to make good on the historical moment and stand up for my people, but I can't. And the main reason for that is because of, I guess, the backing of the Americans, but also as well, Israel's nuclear weapons. And so even if nothing happens in this moment, we have to understand that the impotency that these nations in the region feel at being unable to do anything about the genocide in Gaza, does that lead to Turkey getting a nuclear weapon, right? Because then at least you have parity. And now I can put the Turkish Air Force in the skies against the Israelis. I can hit Israel without threatening of losing, say, Ankara to a nuclear bomb. So is that the reality we see in 3 years, 4 years? Remember, the Pakistanis have already said they'll give these weapons to them. So how long would it actually take? But talk about like that further dissolution of the order we see now, how it's being ripped apart. Like this is a consequence. And I think while we all agree that the current order is not any good, that the role of the American empire, a unipolar hegemony like we exist in right now, is ruinous. I think we'd all agree that as well, that a quick transition to something that is could even be even more dangerous than we see now. So
Right.
I think nuclear proliferation.
Right. Yeah. Because that's literally could be a catastrophic end of game sort of development. If the United States had any hope, or if anybody had any hope that the United States might say, hey, I'm recognizing the trends here and we better start taking some actions to change course, I'm afraid that's going to be disappointed pretty seriously, because there was an interview that was published today. I think it actually happened yesterday, of a retiring commander from the U.S. in the Middle East, General Vowell, was interviewed by Fox News, and they were asking him about the possibility of, what's the situation in Iraq? Is the United States ever going to leave? Now, as you and I have discussed so many times over many years, a lot of our deployments, especially in Iraq and in Syria to this day, are completely pointless. They're counter to American national interest. They're definitely not needed for our security. But here's what this guy's saying, why it is so important that we stay in Iraq. Watch this.
I don't think they're going to ask us to leave now or soon. I think they're very open about wanting us to continue, the United States and Iraq, a healthy relationship mill to mill. So they don't want to ask us to leave. There's no reason to. They respect the mission that we've been there for 10 years to do, and the sacrifices that the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, civilians, and the coalition have contributed to Iraq, not just in the last 10 years, but before that too, after 2003.
So he's running back to 2003 and like it was a really good idea. Oh, the stuff that we've done there. And then he's talking about all these things we've done in 10 years and we don't want to leave. Matt, what in the hell is going on with these people that they are just holding on with white knuckle tenacity, any kind of combat deployment in Iraq? And the same thing is going on in Syria.
I think Major General Vall there is making the case for him to be Admiral Kirby's replacement in the sense of willingness to just lie and fabricate things and pronounce as if you're coming from an alternative world or universe. I mean, this idea that the Iraqis are universally grateful to the Americans for what we've done to them. Oh yeah, absolutely. If they aren't those ingrates, what we've done for them, how could they not be grateful? I mean, Iraq is still experiencing war, political violence, whatever term you want to use for it, to this day. I mean, dozens are killed every month in violence between the government and militia groups and these warlord type groups and, so forth. And as well, then, too, just the consequences of not just America's invasion occupation, but everything that preceded that. And I end up going to go on a rant here. So let me pull it back. But yeah, I mean, this idea that Iraq does want the United States to leave. And the parliament has voted in that way. And just this past week, the Iraqi government made another announcement that it's time for the Americans to leave. And that we're going to be having talks on this starting in the fall. So his statement that we're not going anywhere, the Iraqis want us to stay, is, as untrue as his romanticization.
And it was so odd that you see him kind of having this stream of consciousness thought out loud. He said, but I mean, why would they? There's no reason for us to leave.
That's what's really right. And that's what's really scary.
That doesn't even enter his thinking.
Yeah, right. That's really scary. But that's how you get to be in the position he's in. And that's how, and who knows, maybe he was playing that off. He knew what he was going to say, and he was going to transition with that. Why would they? Just to really show his bona fides as a tried and true American patriot who understands what the great sacrifices of our soldiers in Iraq meant to our freedoms here at the United States. See, I can say that nonsense too. Right. I mean, so is it something that, right? I mean, see, I don't know. Who knows? Anyway, it's either you've got someone who is a fool or someone who is just a complete grifter who is in command of the U.S. forces in Iraq right now.
Yeah, and to underscore your initial comment there that maybe he's trying to get Admiral Kirby's job since he's retiring apparently. He may also be looking for General Keene's job or one like it, because here's another one he was also over the weekend. He was being asked about the significance of the improving relations between Russia and China and the threat that could pose to the United States. And according to the way General Keene sees it, man, there's just no reason for this. It's crazy. It's out of nowhere. And China is really aggressive, and we need to do something about it. Watch this. Roll the tape.
The threat that we're facing, Stuart, I'm on a congressional commission, been on it for 18 months, bipartisan, and we conclude the threats from these nations are serious and dangerous and something we have not seen since World War II.
Wow.
And the likelihood is real that the United States could be involved in multiple theaters of war at the same time as we were in World War II, because look at what's already happening. War in Europe, war in the Middle East, China threatening war in the Indo-Pacific region. So these airplanes are just a symbol of something that's much larger that's threatening the United States. And Stuart, they're aggressive and they're confident because they believe the United States leadership is weak, and they have an opportunity here to exploit our vulnerabilities.
So, Matt, the only issue is that we have weak leadership, and the Chinese are trying to exploit our weakness. It's not because of anything we do. It's just irrational. I mean, what else could be so clear?
Yeah, I've got a friend of mine, George. He has a podcast out in Iowa, and whenever something like this comes up, what he pops up on that podcast is the clip from Casino where Robert De Niro is talking to the guy who is in charge of the slot machines that just got jacked for the second time in a row. And he says, you're either too dumb or you're in on it. And, in either way, he says, you can't work here, which I wish that was the case, right? Which wouldn't that be great if someone said that to Jack Keane or to Major General Val? Look, man, you're either too dumb or you're in on it. And either way, we can't have you here. I mean, wouldn't that be amazing? But you have this though of this question of, is this one great big put on? Is this a con job, or is there really this degree of ignorance?
Well, what I also found, he kind of glossed over this, but I thought it was, I'm like, hang on a second. This guy's a defense contractor. He sits on a bunch of boards. What is he doing on a congressional committee that's designed to find out how much money we need to spend and where we need to send it? Yeah. I mean, that's kind of conflict of interest pretty directly.
Oh, I mean, it reminds me of the master of that, Dick Cheney, who, when the head of Halliburton, who, when George Bush says who should be my vice president, he says I should be. And then he cooks up and, creates a war that provides $30 billion to Halliburton, and 20 some odd years later, the man's still held unaccountable for it, right? Living life nice, fat, and happy in McLean, Virginia, eating steak and lobster every night, right? I mean, so that that conflict of interest is just, it's how the system goes. And so everything becomes baked in, right? And everything gets reinforced. And this is what, Noam Chomsky talks about. The person who's sitting in that chair for that major news network interviewing Jack Keane is not ever going to contradict him or bring up anything inconvenient or uncomfortable or ask him a hard question. If he was that or she was that kind of person, they would never have gotten into that interviewer's chair anyway. So we were living in a reality, Danny, where everything is so reinforced. It's essentially a chicken and egg argument of how did we get here? Why is it like this? There's so many layers to this foundation that's been around for ever, essentially. We inherited from the British, so yeah.
And improved on it in a negative way. I know you're running short on time here, but there's one last point I want to touch on here. And you just kind of brought it up there in your last comment, in that, why are they doing things? So according to Jack Keane, China and Russia are coming together because we're weak. And so it's like this tension. They're always looking to devour us, and all they're held back by is our strength. It's not anything that we do. But another event that came out over the weekend, came out of the Indo-Pacific that the United States is looking to expand its warfighting capability. Watch this.
Big thing that was agreed to was the Americans said that they will turn their headquarters in Japan for U.S. forces into an operational headquarters. Currently, it's just an administrative outfit that apologizes to the Japanese when the Americans do something wrong. But if you turn it into a real warfighting headquarters and have that go along with what the Japanese have just started to do, which is get their own joint operation headquarters, it offers some real possibilities in the future for the Americans and the Japanese to actually have a useful defense relationship in the sense that it can do real world short notice operations.
So in the announcement that the United States made, and while they're upgrading a warfighting headquarters in Japan, was they said, well, if any contingencies happen to come out in there, i.e. China-Taiwan issue, and we need to go fight China on behalf of Taiwan, it would be better to do if we had a headquarters there, because the Indo-Pacific headquarters is like 3,500 miles away. And of course, wow, that far away, it would really be bad. It would make it harder for us. Okay, hang on. The Pentagon is a little further than that away. The president is a little further than that. All they got to do is pick up a phone. They have a secure telecom. Distance is irrelevant. It could be 35 meters. It could be 3,500 miles. It doesn't make any difference. So that alone is real suspicious of why you're claiming. That's why you need to set up a warfighting headquarters in Japan after all these years, unless you're getting ready to fight some. So my question to you is, if you are on the Chinese side of this, given everything that's already happened here, how are you going to relate to that? Are you going to say, oh, well, we better back down, or are you going to take a different course of action?
Yeah, so this is analogous to the United States having that type of warfighting headquarters in Korea, where you have U.S. forces Korea, and they are actually a warfighting organization with a command and control structure meant to run a war. In Japan, as was said before, the U.S. forces Japan was strictly administrative. That's where the paperwork routed through. That's where any type of construction on the bases, things like that. That was the ultimate top level authority for that type of thing. So very administrative. And so now you've created this warfighting organization there. What is that message to China? And hopefully, along with the aggressive message that you referenced, Danny, the Chinese understand this, and I think they do, as the political gesture that it really is. The Japanese wanted this warfighting headquarters just as much as the Americans did. In fact, the news report I read about it said how it's only going to have a 3-star American general leading it, and the Japanese really were pushing for a 4-star, right? Because they want that level of prominence. They want that attention. There are Japanese neoconservatives. I'm not sure what you call them in Japanese, but the same type, the same brood that we have here in the United States has steadily gained power in Japan. And they want this. They want this ability to demonstrate the close relationship between the United States, because they see that might then as their might as well. And it fits into, their aspirations for rebirth as Japan being the regional hegemon, right? So you have this rivalry between Japan and China that has existed a very long time. And so how does this, what does this mean for the domestic politics of Japan? Why is it important for it? And hopefully the Chinese see that as the Americans currying favor with this Japanese political faction, as well then up to just being one more type of in-your-face machismo posturing by the Americans. And hopefully that's what the Chinese take it as opposed to a provocation that causes them to ratchet up in one level, which is essentially what we saw happen in Eastern Europe for these last, let's say, especially 15, 16 years.
Right. I know we're just about out of time. Last question I want to ask you, Orban's position, which we showed in all those clips at the beginning, is that there is a shift in the balance of power and in leadership, and Washington is going in a bad direction that is exacerbating that shift, making it even go more rapidly. Do you see any possibility that if there's either a President Kamala Harris or President Donald Trump, either one, that trend would shift?
No, I don't. I think regardless of who the American president is, you're going to have a maintenance of a foreign policy platform that looks 80% at least similar to their predecessor. And certainly with regards to the American policy towards Europe and then towards Russia, I don't see any change. Donald Trump's posturing and Donald Trump's statements aside, he's going to bring in people potentially like Mike Bolton, Nikki Haley, Tom Cotton, and others. And so the policy is going to be effectively the same policy we saw in Trump. And Trump maybe will try and get a negotiated solution to the war in Ukraine faster than Harris administration would. But you look at Trump's records on this, and it's very easy for him to shift on things as well. So, yeah.
Well, that's not very encouraging. We need to get some bold new leadership in there that goes in a 60% different direction. Probably would be useful at this point. But
yeah, I would. Trump to me is the most malleable president we've had in our lifetime, and you could see that with decisions he made, particularly in foreign policy, where say he starts off with Afghanistan, say I'm going to drop more bombs on Afghanistan in 2 years than any of my predecessors did combined, kind of thing, and then he's like, okay, let's go talk to the Taliban now. So the way he was able to swing the pendulum, and it wasn't from some great internal discussion he had in his head, his own reflections. It was just because the argument that was now out of favor, and he's going to take this new one. So he just goes, descends, I think, down the list.
Well, we're going to continue keeping on this. Thanks ever so much for coming on today, Matt. I know you got to run. You got another media hit here to go to. The people want to hear you. Thank you for coming on today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Denny.
And we really appreciate you guys watching us too. We always ask that you please like and subscribe, because the information you get here, folks, you just don't get hardly any other places here, because we are giving you the truth of it. It's not, from an American perspective or from some other perspective. We give you the true perspective. And these are the consequences, no matter what popular words people may say. Be sure to like and subscribe, because that helps us expand our channel so more people get access to the truth. We're going to have a really big week for you this week, folks. And you just had the great Matthew Ho. We also have Larry Johnson, Doug McGregor, Colonel Jacques Beau. It's going to be a packed week. Don't miss any of it. If you subscribe and hit that little notify button, you won't miss any of it. Thanks, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.